Welcome back. Thank you for joining me for our second day of 10-3. Today we're going to do some more multiplying. But when I say multiplying this time, I mean we're going to be talking about distributing and foiling. So, when you look at our first example for today, when you see that there is a term out front and is multiplying a parenthesis, what that means is you need to distribute that term in. So we're going to take that square root of 10 and we're going to multiply it to that square root of 6. So square root of 10 times square root of 6, well, since both of them are inside the square root, you can just multiply those two numbers. And now we also have to distribute that square root of 10 to the square root of 3, or to 3. Now, since 3 is outside the square root, and the square root of 10 is inside, they can't exactly combine. So what ends up happening is they have to stay separate. Now, looking at square root of 10, there's no perfect square that pulls out of that. So we know we're already good. However, 60 does have a square root that can pull out of it. In fact, it has a 4. 60 is 4 times 15. So, even when you're doing these problems, remember you are always looking to simplify your radical. So, square root of 4 becomes 2, so we get 2 square roots of 15 plus 3 square roots of 10. And that is going to be your final answer. All right, now looking at our next one. So when you have two binomials, when you have two parentheses, that is telling us that we're going to have to FOIL this. So foiling process, the F means first. Square root of 6 times the square root of 6. Well, remember, a square root times itself just gives you back the number that was inside. It gives you back that 6. Outside, square root of 6 times the square root of 3. Well, both of them are inside the square root, so we can multiply them to be the square root of 18. Negative 2 square roots of 3, square root of 6. Well, now we have a piece that's on the outside, but then the square root of 3 and square root of 6 are both on the inside, so those multiply inside of our square root. Negative 2 square roots of 3 times the square root of 3. Well, we have the 2 on the outside of the square root, and now the inside, square root of 3 times square root of 3. Well, we know that a square root times itself just gives you back the number that was inside. So actually, the square root of 3 times square root of 3 piece just becomes 3. Now, we still have kind of a mess here. So what we're going to do is we're going to start simplifying. So square root of 18 minus 2 square roots of 18. I have the same thing inside those radicals. So from the previous piece of this lesson, you should know that that means that these are like radicals. If I have one of them and I'm subtracting 2 away, that means I'm going to have minus 1 square roots of 18. Then 2 times 3 is 6. Well, 6 minus 6. So really, we just end up with a negative square root of 18 after all of that mess clears. But again, the goal is just knowing to FOIL. Then simplify any radical that you can, then combine any like radical. All right. Let's take a look at our next one. Now, when we have a parentheses squared, hopefully you remember back, we introduced this way back in chapter 8. When you have a binomial squared, the best thing to do, oh, I'm sorry, I began writing that wrong. The best thing to do is write it out so you can see precisely what you're supposed to do. Because when you write it out, it's a lot easier to remember that you are, in fact, foiling this out. Square root of 7 times the square root of 7. Well, a radical times itself to give you back the number that was inside. Outside, well, the 3 is outside the square root. 7 is inside, so those don't combine. Negative 3 times square root of 7. Again, the negative 3 is on the outside, and the square root, or in the 7 is on the inside, so they don't combine. Negative 3 times negative 3 is a plus 9. And now we can go through and we can combine our like terms. So here, 7 plus 19 is just two ordinary numbers. Negative 3 square root of 7 minus 3 more square root of 7. Well, those are the same radical. They have the same number under the square root. So I can combine those. Negative 3 minus 3 gives me negative 6 of those square roots of 7. And then that is actually the end. Our final answer. All right, moving right along. So let's move into those final three examples to review the concepts that we just talked about. So this first example here, notice I have a single thing outside of a parenthesis. So that means all I have to do is distribute it in. Square root of 2 times the square root of 6. Well, both of those are inside the square root, so they can multiply to the square root of 12. Square root of 2 times 5. The 5 is on the outside, the 2 is on the inside, so they have to stay separate. Now, square root of 12 is one of those special ones that I want you to notice. That can break apart into 4 and 3. So really, that's going to turn into 2 square roots of 3. Then we still have that plus 5 square roots of 2. And that's going to be our final answer. For our next one, we're looking at a parenthesis squared. And remember, what that means is we have that parenthesis twice. And when we write it out, it gets a lot easier to see that really our method for solving this is going to be the foiling process. So I'm going to FOIL this out. Square root of 11 times the square root of 11. Well, a radical times itself gives you back the radical that was, or the number that was inside. Square root of 11 times negative 2. Well, the negative 2 is on the outside. Square root of 11 is on the inside, so they can't combine. Negative 2 times square root of 11 again. Well, once again, the negative 2 is on the outside. Square root of 11 is on the inside, so they can't combine. Negative 2 times negative 2 will be a positive 4. Once we get to this point, now we look to see, does anything combine? Well, 11 and 4, that's just going to give us 15. Negative 2 square root of 11 minus 2 square roots of 11. They are the same radical, okay? Both are square roots of 11, so we can actually combine those like terms. Negative 2 minus 2 more will give us a minus 4 square roots of 11, and that is going to be our final answer. And now, our last one. When you see two parentheses like that, okay, we should know that that means we are going to FOIL this out. So, square root of 6 times 4 square roots of 3. All right, well, I have a piece that's outside the square root, and then I have two pieces inside. So the 3 and the 6 will multiply to 18. Outside, square roots of 6 times 3 square roots of 6. Well, we have the 3 on the outside. And now, square root of 6 times the square root of 6. we have a radical times itself. So that's just going to give us the number that was inside. Negative 2 square roots of 3 times 4 square roots of 3. Well, we multiply those pieces on the outside. So the negative 2 and the 4 multiply to negative 8. And now we multiply the square roots. Square root of 3 times the square root of 3. Well, that's one of those instances. We have a square root times itself. So it's just going to give us the number that was inside, the 3. And now finally, last, negative 2 square roots of 3 times 3 square roots of 6. We multiply the pieces on the outside. Negative 2 times 3 gives us a negative 6. Now we multiply the square roots. Square root of 3 times the square root of 6 give us square root of 18. Now, let's start combining our like things, all right? So, here we have 18 and minus 24. So let's combine those two things. 18 minus 24 gives us a negative 6. Then I also see 4 square roots of 18 minus 6 square roots of 18. They are the same radical, so we are going to combine them. Now, if you notice, we're not quite done yet. There's still a little something that we can do. Because notice that 18. That 18 can actually break up into 9 and 2. So we're going to get a 3 from the square root of 9. So our final answer is actually going to be negative 6 minus 6 square roots of 2. Don't forget to always, always, always simplify your radical expressions. It is an absolute must that you are simplifying those. All right, so thank you so much for joining me. This is actually it for today. So make sure you have all of this written out, and then we will continue with our practice work in class tomorrow.